Act 1, open on Kanisha, a young dark-skinned woman working on the McGregor plantation. Work begins. It takes over her whole body. You can start the wave. Act 1, open on Kanisha, a young dark-skinned woman working on the McGregor plantation. Work begins. It takes over her whole body. She is twerking as if Rihanna herself is in the room watching. Jim enters. Kanisha, what the hell are you doing? I'm sorry, Master Jim, which he quickly corrects to Overseer Jim. For some reason, though, Kanisha is still twerking. This arouses Mr. Jim, and he begins to grind on her. I guess she liked it because they start talking very nasty. She asks him to call her a nasty, lazy negress. He offers to spell it with his tongue. Madam McGregor is in her room on the plantation. She calls for Philip, and in comes a mixed-race guy in a tux. She asks him to play his violin for her. He is hesitant as Master McGregor says that mulatto music can woo whites away from their God-given path. Madam McGregor dismisses this. She says only gorilla niggas straight from Africa can cast spells. So, Philip plays Beethoven. She stops him, calling it European garbage. She requests Negro music, something he actually likes. But I like Beethoven. She asks for something that will make her hoot and holler like the negresses waiting outside. So, Philip plays Pony. Madam McGregor throws herself onto Philip. She kisses him. She eats his booty like groceries. She says how fun it is to be the man. She retrieves a black dildo and starts to push it inside him. She asks if he likes it. He says he's not sure. Dustin is a white indentured servant stacking hay. A well-clad Gary enters and puts him to work. Dustin responds, "Yes, sir." Gary remarks that the name Dustin is the only white thing about him. Dustin says Gary is a pretty white name too. So it is corrected to nigger Gary. Dustin is pretty argumentative for a servant, and a struggle for power begins between them. Gary provokes Dustin, calling him Boot Dustin, for all he's good for is Dustin nigger's boots. With a scream, Dustin tackles Gary. They fight, but as they do, the movements become more and more erotic. Bloodied faces begin colliding. Dustin breaks away. He begins licking Gary's boot. Gary ejaculates. Gary cries. Jim is thrusting into Kanisha. She asks him once more to call her a negress. Eventually, he does. Kanisha nears climax. Jim slows to a stop. Kanisha screams no. Jim yells, "Starbucks," the safe word. Patricia and T bust in. Act 2, process. They are all seated in a more modern room, and it's awkward as hell. Group couples therapy. Patricia and T, the hosts of this psychological experiment, remind the room that it was only fantasy play. Day 4 of a 7-day program, the day they had been preparing for. Dustin begins processing with, Gary came, and it was complicated. Gary says it's because Dustin didn't like having to be white. Dustin says, "Fuck you, Gary. I'm worried because you cried as you came." Alana, who was happy to play Madam McGregor, says, "Honestly, it was just hot to me." She says it opened doors for her. She became a woman she's never been before because she was able to express exactly what she wanted to a man. Jim loses it. What's going on here? This is insane! And how this was supposed to be therapy to help his wife. Dustin too says it hurts to see Gary hurt. T interjects and says that it is therapy, radical therapy, antebellum sexual performance therapy, designed to help black people who don't feel sexual pleasure from their white partners anymore. Jim still feels like he's traumatizing Kenesha. Dustin too. Alana says that she feels like the white men in the room are running the conversation, and this sets Dustin off. He says to insinuate that he is white is ignorant and violent, and that when he suggested to Gary moving to a nicer neighborhood, he didn't mean a whiter neighborhood, just a place where he wouldn't be perceived as another white gentrifier. The first to express their experiences of racial trauma were those with the closest proximity to white supremacy. This gets Patricia and T all excited because it's good for their research. The research explores how psychology fails to acknowledge the implications of black and brown subjection to the psychological warfare of white supremacy. One of the affects being alexithymia, an inability to express one's feelings. Philip is confused. So, my dick won't go up because of racism? The couples were selected because of their anxiety disorders, OCD most pronounced in all three POC, musical obsession disorder being one of the symptoms. Philip begins to open up more about his experiences of blackness. He says how many of his girlfriends weren't able to call him black, how he doesn't even really see himself as black or white, just a hot guy. He talks about an experience he had when he attended a predominantly white college, how after a football game, a boy in the showers called him a nigger, and said that the only reminder that Philip was a nigger was his big nigger dick. An upperclassman said, "Philip is not a nigger. Philip is Philip," and he ran with that. Jim leaves the room. Kenesha speaks. She speaks of a sense of control that she felt during the fantasy play that she often doesn't because of her OCD. Gary agrees. Philip does not. Philip says he felt like a slave, similarly to a past cuckold relationship between himself, Alana, and her then husband. Alana insists it wasn't racial, but Philip says it was for him. He says he knew that Alana's husband just saw a black guy doing his wife. But that's kind of why he liked it, because he understood why he was being desired. Dustin interjects to tell us more about how oppressed he is by white supremacy. And Gary says, "Well, I'm black. I come in beautiful shades and colors, but they called me black. So that's what I am every day. So what now? If you aren't white, Dustin, what are you?" He speaks of how he feels like an accessory to Dustin. "I'm so cool, I'm so different, I do a black guy." Jim returns. He says he loves Kenesha, but she looks at him like he's a virus. Kenesha agrees. She speaks of how his people killed populations of indigenous people with diseases they brought. She literally says, "It's not you, it's me," and leaves. Act 3, exercise. Kenesha is in her room, packing to leave. Jim enters to listen. She begins to reflect on past field trips that her school would take to plantations, and how fun her white peers would say it was. How her mother would tell her to hold her head up high as she walks through the devil's house, and show her elders that she has no fear of the demons that live in the walls. She speaks of a tingle of electricity that she felt on her neck as she did. The same tingle she felt when she met Jim. How because he was so un-American, so Oxford, she thought that his whiteness was different. She says that the sex was good until it wasn't. Jim begins to take off Kenisha's shirt. She speaks of a fog that lifted one day that revealed him for what he was, white, a demon. And her elders were watching her lay in bed every night with a demon who thinks he's a saint. But during the fantasy play, they both acknowledged that he was a demon. It was honest. Jim pushes Kenisha face first into the bed. He begins the fantasy play again with all the racial slurs and obscenities that he couldn't use before. With a nod of consent from Kenisha, he plunges into her. Kenisha screams Starbucks. They stop. She thanks him for listening to her. Thank you for listening to me, baby. Thank you for listening to me.